It's time for That's Not What My Bible Says, Why Bible Translations Differ. Question number 2 from a YouTube viewer in Dodge, Dakota. The reason I write to you is regarding Isaiah 66:5. I find it to be a conundrum in comparison to many so-called errors of other versions I have been considering. It seems that most modern versions consider "Let God be glorified so we may see your joy" to be a full quote of the revelers. However, the King James Version seems to conclude the closing quotation marks at glorified, and Isaiah is reassuring the audience that God is coming with the second clause. This seems to be a fairly large difference that I don't quite understand. Please note, if you are able to respond, I don't consider myself a scholar, simply someone who seeks to follow the convictions God gives me as much as I can understand them, which seems to be very little lately. First, I need to remind viewers out there in YouTube land that the King James Version does not use quotation marks. They weren't required in 1611. The King James did use a device equivalent to an opening quotation mark when you see in the King James Version a capitalized word in the middle of a sentence that is not a proper noun. That indicates the beginning of a quotation. My favorite example, for reasons you will discover if you watch my video, Why Bible Typography Matters, is Genesis 24:2. And Abraham said unto his eldest servant of his house that ruled over all that he had, Put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. Put is capitalized because obviously that's where the quotation begins. Precisely the same phrase is not capitalized toward the end of the book because it isn't the start of a quotation. In Genesis 47:29, look where the caps are. And the time drew nigh that Israel, that is Jacob, must die. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, and here's the start of the quotation, so it's capitalized, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. The put was not capped here because it wasn't the start of the quotation. And then he goes on to say, And deal kindly and truly with me, bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But then where do these quotations end? In the vast majority of cases, I'd say that the context makes this more than sufficiently clear. Let's just use these two verses I've just cited. In Genesis 24, it's just utterly obvious that the quotation from the lips of Isaac continues until verse 5, which opens, The servant said to him. You don't need closing quotation marks. Context is a perfectly safe guide here to let you know when Isaac is done talking. In Genesis 47, the same thing happens. Clearly, once Joseph begins to reply, Jacob's words to him must have come to their end. For advocates of exclusive use of the King James Version, the fact that it does not have quotation marks and that Hebrew and Greek didn't have them either is case closed that the King James practice is superior. But actually, the King James does have a quotation mark, that is, a way to mark the opening of quotations. It just doesn't have closing quotation marks. So it half matches the Hebrew and Greek practice and half violates it. And what are we really going to do? Many ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament didn't put spaces between words, and yet Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts did. Which practice should we follow in English? And we need to think carefully about what language is. We all share a sense, one linguist shared too, that the spoken version of each language is its base form, the one from which writing derives. That's because very small children can hear and then speak their language, whatever it is, years before they can read or write. And many illiterate people are perfectly good at English, but they can't write it. The written version of a language also tends to diverge over time from the spoken variety, especially in spelling. It becomes almost a language in itself. Nobody has to think about where and whether to use commas while talking, although us writer-editors do that anyway, we can't help it. And written sentences can handle being more complex than most spoken ones. That complexity rises when you consider the level of meaning called the paragraph. It's rare, in my judgment, for people to speak off the cuff in paragraphs. That's a specialized skill developed by people who read and write a lot of written English. There are other niceties in written language that aren't in spoken language too, like that little apostrophe in the word aren't. There's also often a level of formality expected in nearly all prose that is comparatively rarely expected in speech. You might say, I have a whole nother gallon of ice cream at home, but your word processor will flag "nother" as not a word, even though everybody understands you perfectly. I'm trying to say that written language, at least in English, the one language I'm most familiar with, tends to add its own layer of complexities that simply aren't present in the spoken version of the tongue. but that are a necessary part of the written variety. You can't be neutral when it comes to quotation marks then. Having them forces you, yes, to specify the beginnings and endings of quotations, and this puts us in binds at times, like in John 3. If you look at red letter Bibles, some of them end Jesus' quotation in John 3:15, and they make John 3:16, the famous verse, and the paragraph that it heads up, into a comment made by John, not Jesus. Others keep Christ's quotation going all the way till the end of that paragraph. It's not perfectly clear who's right. But again, omitting quotation marks is not somehow neutral. Not having quotation marks also says something. It says you are reading something odd and non-standard. That's because, in my experience, 99.999% of formal written English, like the Bible, today uses quotation marks. Newspapers use them, slides during newscasts use them, academic papers use them, personal letters use them, emails use them. They even get used in a few places where they shouldn't be used, like on the sides of box trucks owned by local businesses. That's one of my pet peeves. No quotation marks are required in standard written English around the slogans of businesses. There are a very few dialogue-heavy novels that I've seen that use paragraph breaks or, in the distant past, names and colons to indicate who's speaking instead of quotation marks, but normal written English requires quotation marks to set off quotations. The Bible translator's job is not actually to translate the speech of God into the speech of the English or French or the Russians. It's to put the written words of God into the appropriate written variety of each language. And in English, that demands quotation marks. And that then means editors have to make some choices. Now we can finally get back to Isaiah 66:5 and the choices available to today's translations. I will read this verse in the English Standard Version and then in the King James Version. Note especially what each does with marking the quotations. Hear the word of the Lord, you who tremble at his word. Your brothers who hate you and cast you out for my name's sake have said, let the Lord be glorified, that we may see your joy, end quote. But it is they who shall be put to shame. That's the ESV. So we've got God speaking, and what he does is he quotes the brothers who hate you. They say, let the Lord be glorified so that we may see your joy. And God replies, but it is they who will be put to shame. Now here's the King James Version. Hear the word of the Lord, ye that tremble at his word. And here we go with a capital letter in the middle of the sentence. So we know this is the start of the Lord's speech according to the King James translators. Your brethren that hated you, that cast you out for my name's sake, said, and here's another capital letter, so we know that the brethren who hated you are the ones who are now speaking. Let the Lord be glorified. But he shall appear to your joy, and they shall be ashamed. We know the two places where quotations start in this verse in the King James Version, according to the King James translators, because of those capital letters. But we don't really know where they considered the second quotation to stop. That's in part because commas and especially colons got used differently in the King James Version than they are used today. I've tried to get to the bottom of the King James punctuation system. I've looked at various scholars, and I have frankly failed. I don't know what the colon especially means in this last phrase. I'm just pretty sure from reading tons of King James that it doesn't mean what we would mean by it, namely, further explanation is coming. That just doesn't work here, and it usually doesn't work throughout the King James, in my experience. I think I share the sense of the gentleman who contacted me, however, that in the King James, colons are a bigger break than commas. So it does appear that the King James translators were stopping the quotation after the first phrase. It's just, let the Lord be glorified. This is the way Puritan-era commentator, writing not all that too long after the King James Version, Matthew Henry, took the King James here. A few views exist on this passage. Calvin, 500 years ago, listed 3, including the one that is most common today, even though he didn't opt for it. But most commentators among the dozen or so that I checked, they like the idea that let the Lord be glorified is sarcastic speech in the mouths of the believer's enemies. This is a bit obscure, and that makes our job determining where the quotation ends difficult. We'll talk more about that. The next phrase is even more difficult. The one the English Standard Version renders as, that we may see your joy. Here's the translation note on the phrase in the Net Bible. The point of this statement is unclear. I agree. And this is the one phrase that makes it the most difficult to place the closing quotation marks, because if context is our main guide, an unclear phrase is going to make it very difficult to be sure where to end the quote. Neither the grammar nor the meaning give us enough to go on. We're kind of stuck. One thing we have to go on, though, is that actually the work of the medieval Masoretes, the Jewish scholars who preserved the Hebrew Bible in the form we now have it today, gives us a clue. This is an area in which I am far from an expert, but one of the top commentators on Isaiah tells me, and I did check this out for myself to the best of my ability, that the Masoretes put cantillation marks into the text to indicate that the quotation of the wicked lasts until the word joy, just like the modern versions have it. Cantillation marks can function sort of like punctuation marks in the Hebrew, but they are very different from what you and I are used to in English, and I can't explain them because I don't fully understand them. The Masoretes were not inspired, they were interpreters. Their punctuation marks are commentary, but that commentary is generally thought to have been passed down in oral tradition, and it ought to weigh something with us, especially when we have essentially nothing else to go on. My best guess is that the Masoretes turned the tide of modern interpretation of this obscure verse into the direction that it's gone in nearly all the modern translations. By the way, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, takes it in an entirely different direction that I won't even talk about. In a way, because we simply don't know what "that we may see your joy" means, it kind of doesn't matter where we place that final quotation mark. It's sufficiently clear that the final phrase, "but it is they who shall be put to shame," is a judgment on the wicked people God is talking about, the ones who have cast out the true believers. And that, very simply, is the lesson, the application to be drawn from this passage. No matter what the obscure portions mean, and no matter where the quotation marks ought to be placed, we can say that when God's people are faithful to Him, they may get cast out by their own brothers, even mocked by them. But it's the mockers who will be put to shame. We have other portions of the Bible, of course, that tell us this. Jesus says, in words I often think of, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." That's Matthew 5:11 through 13 in the ESV. That's from the Sermon on the Mount. And we have Jesus saying that every idle word that men use, they're going to have to give account for in the day of judgment. The New Testament teaches, too, the ultimate vindication of those who are faithful to the Lord, even if temporarily they are cast out by their brothers. And even if that casting out lasts throughout this life, God delights in defending the oppressed and in making the oppressors and oppressed change places. Just read Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2 or Mary's in Luke 1, and you'll see those reversals. God takes note when people tremble at His word and suffer for it. There's a value in reading the King James and being reminded that in certain places in Scripture, I just don't know how many, but I would guess they are relatively few, the proper interpretation of the passage relies in part on where the quotation marks are thought to go. But think about it. These are likely to be few because written language in ancient times had no quotation marks, so context would have always had to suffice for them. Presumably then, we have all the context we need to make faithful and careful decisions. So I can be forced to decide for myself where quotation marks go, and that's okay. That's a good thing. But it's not English. It's odd English. Or I can have someone decide for me in advance, and that has the benefit of putting the Bible into my language, of being more intelligible to contemporary readers. In this case, I side with all major modern evangelical English Bible translators in feeling that quotation marks are a necessary part of translation into written English. Let me finish up with another set of comments, however. At its heart, conflict within the Christian church over textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible or of the Greek New Testament is usually between those evangelical Christians who believe the gospel and the Bible, who say that we have a perfect copy of our inerrant Bible, and those who say that God has given us slightly imperfect copies of our inerrant Bible. It's pretty much solely our King James only brothers who take the former position, and I feel the pull of it. I do at times wish for perfect confidence in every jot and tittle of the Hebrew and Greek Testaments. I wish my textual critic friend Peter Gurry didn't have a job, or rather that he didn't have to have that job, because the text of Scripture was completely certain. That's what I sometimes wish. Close friends of mine and I call this view textual absolutism, but we call our view, the latter view, textual confidence. That's because it seems quite clear to us that we have amazingly accurate, but not jot and tittle perfect copies of the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts of the Bible. When Jesus said in Matthew 5:18 that not a single jot or tittle would pass from the law until all is fulfilled, he didn't mean that we'd have perfectly preserved manuscript copies in the Hebrew and Greek. He meant that the efficacy of all of the laws would last until they were all fulfilled. The fact is that all of our copies of Hebrew and Greek manuscripts of any size differ at least a little, and since God has not chosen to tell us how to pick the perfect ones, we need to be thankful for the level of confidence that we can have in the text of our Bibles. Every existing manuscript of the Bible teaches the very same Christian faith. What in the world does all this have to do with Isaiah 66:5? Well, one of the major reasons that I just cannot accept the textual absolutist view is what we just witnessed in that passage. It would be awfully odd of God to go to all the trouble of giving us perfect copies of the Bible, but then fail to give us inspired and perfect commentaries and lexicons. It seems rather that God has been content to let minute aspects of his revelation fade into some obscurity, while letting the big picture be remarkably clear, along with a ton of the little details. I offered some reasons why he might have done this in a recent video series on the clarity of Scripture, but the King James translators themselves acknowledged this very fact and gave some wise, scripturally informed answers about why God might have done this. They went on about this at some length under the heading, Reasons Moving Us to Set Diversity of Senses in the Margin, where there is great probability for each. I'm not going to read their direct words because, frankly, they are too difficult for modern speakers and readers of English. I'm going to translate them into our English. But by all means, go read them for yourself. The King James preface, Translators to the Reader, is absolute gold. This is what they said. Some perhaps would choose not to place a variety of senses in the margin, lest the authority of the Scriptures for deciding controversies would be shaken by that show of apparent uncertainty. But we consider that judgment to be unsound on this point, because, though, as Chrysostom said, whatever we truly need to know in Scripture is clear, and though, as Augustine said, in the things that are plainly written in Scripture, we find all we need to know regarding faith, hope, and love, nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that it has pleased God in his divine providence to scatter words and sentences here and there that are difficult and doubtful. He did this partly to whet our wits, partly to keep the curious from loathing the Scriptures for their plainness, partly to stir up our devotion to desire the assistance of God's Spirit through prayer, and partly that we might be encouraged to seek insights from our fellow Christians. These difficult and obscure things in Scripture are not in doctrinal points that concern salvation. No. Here the Scriptures are plain. They are instead in matters of less importance. So fearfulness is more becoming for us than confidence in these places. It is better to acknowledge the doubtfulness of things that are secret than to fight over things that are uncertain. There are many words in the Scriptures which are found only once, having neither brother nor neighbor, as the Hebrews say, so that we cannot be helped by examining their usage in place after place. There are many rare names of certain birds, animals, and precious stones, over which the Jewish scholars themselves are so divided that they seem to have chosen definitions solely in order to be able to say something, rather than because they were sure of what they said. The ancient translator of the Latin Vulgate, Jerome, said the same of the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, in such a case, isn't it wise to use a marginal note to encourage the reader to do some more study rather than dogmatizing peremptorily? If it's the sin of unbelief to doubt things that are clear, it's the sin of presumption to be certain about things the Spirit of God has left questionable, even in the judgment of the judicious. Pastors understandably want to communicate confidence in the Word to their sheep. I know I do. But I want my level of confidence to match the clarity God has chosen to place in his revelation. And in plenty of minor places, so say the King James translators, judicious people who love the Lord and are skilled at reading the Bible are a bit unsure of the precise meaning of what God has said. Isaiah 66:5 is one of those places. The overall point is clear, But in the judgment of multiple judicious people, some questions about this passage, including where the closing quotation marks should go, must be left till the last day.